There's a lot of talk today about equality, and a lot of different people interpret that word in a lot of different ways. My name is Gary Weber, and today I want to talk to you about what Jesus defined as equality and how he went about bringing it to us through his life and ministry. So in Luke chapter 10, we see two amazing encounters. One is an encounter that Jesus has with a lawyer who is coming to try to prove himself by asking Jesus, hey, who is my neighbor? And the other is an encounter Jesus had at the home of some friends. Well, first, this lawyer comes to Jesus and basically says, hey, Jesus, you say to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, but just tell me who my neighbor is. Now, this was a loaded question in Jesus' day because in the culture in which Jesus was teaching, people really defined their neighbor as people who are like them. People who thought the way they thought, who had the same heritage, background, genealogy, skin color, spoke the same language. And Jesus told this story. He said, look, one time there was this guy traveling on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and some thieves beat him and stripped him and left him for dead. And as he's laying on the side of this road to Jericho, a priest comes by and walked on the other side of the road to avoid this naked, bloody man. And then a Levite comes by and he walks on the other side of the road to avoid this guy as well. Now, the irony of this is that if you knew what the road of Jericho to Jericho looked like, you would know that this was ridiculous. Jesus' audience would have laughed when he said this. In other words, these religious people were so concerned about their personal safety, their security, keeping on their agenda and on their time, and really trying to avoid any kind of uncleanliness at all, that they literally risked falling off the cliff to avoid this man who had been left for dead. Meanwhile, Jesus says, along comes a Samaritan. And the Samaritan stopped and helped the guy. He bandaged his wounds. He took him to an inn. He cared for them. And then he even left money with the innkeeper so that the guy would be taken care of. And then Jesus turns back to this lawyer and says, who was a neighbor to the man who was in need? Now, this is a really subtle point, but it's so important because Jesus was putting this Jewish lawyer in the mind and in the shoes of the guy who had been helpless and left for dead on the side of the road, meaning that he didn't get to choose who his neighbor was. In fact, the neighbor was the Samaritan, the most hated, disrespected, reviled person of all. Jews considered them less than human, and yet that's the very person that stopped and helped this guy who was helpless. Jesus was sending a message. You don't get to choose who God uses. And then right after this story, Jesus goes to the home of his friend, Mary and Martha. Martha is in the kitchen getting a meal ready for this huge crowd that has taken over her house. Meanwhile, her sister Mary is doing something that is unheard of in this culture. She's sitting at Jesus' feet. Now, when the scripture says that Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, we need to know that that is a phrase and a euphemism that's used for something more than just sitting at someone's feet. It actually means that it is somebody who is taking up the posture of a student, somebody who is desiring to be somebody's disciple. This was something that women absolutely did not do. In fact, women didn't even occupy the same space as men. So the very fact that Mary was in the room with Jesus and all the disciples was something that I'm sure made everybody uncomfortable, but it made Martha especially uncomfortable. And so at one point she goes to Jesus and she says, hey, Jesus, would you tell Mary to come and help me in the kitchen? In other words, tell her she needs to get back where the women belong in the kitchen. Women don't belong sitting out here at your feet. Now, this is really interesting because you're starting to talk now, not just about racial differences and the way people viewed Samaritans in that day and people who were not like them, but you're now talking about this issue of gender. And so you might have expected that a first century Jewish rabbi would have said, absolutely, hey, Mary, you need to go back to the kitchen because that's a woman's place. It's not what Jesus said. In fact, Jesus turned to Martha and said, Martha, you are worried about so many things, but Mary has chosen the better thing. Jesus shocked the entire crowd by affirming Mary in her decision to sit at his feet, basically proclaiming herself to be one of his disciples. This was such a radical departure for the first century in the Roman world and in the Jewish world. I mean, this just wasn't done at all. And what we see in these two stories is an incredible testimony of how Jesus is trying to level the playing field once again for all these people. He's looking at this Samaritan, somebody who is on the outside of the Jewish community, not even considered to be worthy of attention of the religious people. And yet Jesus has made him the hero. He is the one who really has the hands and feet and the heart of God in helping those who are needy. And then in the story of Mary and Martha, it's not the men who are sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him. In fact, that's not said of any of the other disciples, but it's a woman, and Jesus affirms that. This reminds me that we do not get to choose who God will use, and we should not restrain those whom God would train. It's so important in our day and age to realize that God is working in the hearts and lives of men and women, boys and girls, some of them from different backgrounds, speak different languages, have different skill sets, all kinds of differences, and yet God can use all of them for the purpose of furthering His kingdom and His mission. So I don't know about you, maybe you're somebody who puts yourself in the position of the Samaritan, or maybe you're somebody who thinks of yourself as a Mary, and you've had people tell you that you're not worthy to join Christ in His mission in the world. But I think Jesus has a different message for you. He says, you can be my hands and feet. You can come and take a seat here at my feet. And maybe you're somebody who's just tried to keep people from doing these things. You found all kinds of excuses why so-and-so isn't old enough, isn't good enough, isn't the right color, isn't the right gender, whatever. But maybe you need to take a look at Jesus and ask yourself, what did Jesus say about the qualifications for those who would follow Him? Grace and peace be with you today.